to recap briefly, the last session was basically talking about relationships, but I think what's I think necessary to preface it by is that Orthodox Christianity has an essentially ascetic outlook, and that is a spiritual discipline in order to give us a structure of life to help us work out our salvation, to come to a deeper experience of God and a deeper experience of Jesus Christ. That's really kind of what Orthodoxy is in a nutshell. You can talk about all of these, talk about it as a religion, where it's something you do on Sunday. You can talk about it as a kind of ethnic identity and all this other stuff. But all of that is secondary at best. At most. The real essence of Orthodoxy is this living experience of God which it conveys. And in order to enable us to enter more and more deeply into a living relationship with Jesus Christ, and experience of God in this world. Within that is a very highly developed and very sophisticated spiritual discipline, which touches every aspect of life. Now, there are those people who don't like that, who want to simply live as the culture, whatever culture, tells them to live, and embrace its values, and in doing so, especially if you want to be an Orthodox, or if you claim to be an Orthodox Christian, but you don't live accordingly, it's going to be, you're missing the whole point. It's basically about how do we live in order to grow in our experience of communion with God. So there are two basic aspects of that. One is the mystical dimension, and the other is the ascetic dimension. The mystic dimension is enabled by the ascetic dimension. In other words, to spiritually experience the whole process of repentance and of transforming our minds and our lives into an experience of communion, it takes ascetic effort. In other words, Orthodoxy is not about nice aesthetics, nice music and nice rituals. As I think it was Thomas Merton said, ancient quaint rituals performed in the sacred gloom, and all of this kind of stuff. It's about the living relationship with God. And that relationship with God puts demands on us. And this is where, but not in a legalistic sense. And this is where people, I think, get very confused. That if you, for example, one of the things I constantly hear about in confessions, oh, I didn't fulfill my rule, oh, I didn't fulfill this rule, oh, I broke this rule. It's not about rules and things. It reflects a certain kind of level of spiritual maturity, very low. Because the point of the rules, the point of the discipline, is that it shapes our lives but is not some kind of a rigid straitjacket where if we meet on Friday we're going to go to hell. You know, it's not a reward punishment kind of thing. It's not like if we keep the fast completely, exactly, and to the letter, we're going to get a brownie point in heaven or something like that. It's rather the spiritual benefit is acquired through the whole process. And so if you look at our spiritual life as a whole process of transformation and a process of being renewed according to the being renewed in our minds and in our hearts, rather than simply changing our behavior in certain contexts, then we get much closer, I think, to the reality of what it's all about. The discipline is there, it's important, and it's valuable, but it's not an end in itself. And this is where we so easily, I think, get sidetracked by making it an end in itself. The only thing that's an end in itself is drawing closer to God, and which itself is process, and which itself is because it's a living relationship, as all living relationships are process. Now we talked about relationships within that, and relationships, of course, are very, very important. And one of the most highly defined sets of discipline within the tradition are our relationships with one another, especially around marriage. If you look at the canons, you can't marry anybody who's related to you either physically or spiritually according to 6 degrees. So, in other words, you can't marry your cousin. You're not supposed to marry your spiritual brother or sister. A godchild is not supposed to marry his mother's godmother or god sister or something like that. There's all these degrees of relationship, and the spiritual relationships are regarded actually almost on the same level as the physical relationships. Marriage is not simply about the couple themselves. It's about the joining of families, and it's about bringing forth a new family. Marriage is far more than a blessing for sex, but sex is delimited or is restricted within the tradition to the context of marriage for Orthodox Christians, because it's something so powerful and so sacred. And the goal, and especially if you read through the marriage service, is to bring forth children. And you read the service, and it's very valuable to read through the services to understand, what the real teaching of the church is, because a lot of the church's teaching, so far as all of, just about every aspect of its life, is contained within the services themselves. But it's not just about bringing forth children. It's about creating this union between families, between clans. It's not just about your own children. It's grandchildren after that, and so on and so forth that it talks about in the marriage service. And so the sexual relationship is precisely directed towards that end. It's never an end in itself. It's never about pleasure for its own sake. It's not about it always has this openness towards bringing forth children, and even within that, for example, there's the canonical tradition and the spiritual tradition, for example, regulates birth control, and the preference is none within the tradition. We mainly differ between the Roman Catholics, or we differ mainly with the Roman Catholics in regards to birth control, in that they make it a much stricter rule, and we give the application to the spiritual father of the couple as to how to apply that rule. But it's also important to understand that there's never any validation of couples living together before marriage, in other words, in a sexual relationship. There's never any validation for any kind of married relationship other than with the intention of creating a new family. Whether they have children or not, they're given the blessing to have children, but whether they do or not is a different story. And that's also up to God's will. And some will and some won't, and that's just the way it is. Divorce is highly regulated by the church. When in the scriptures it talks about divorce, both in both the Lord's own teaching as well as the teaching of St. Paul, divorce is not. It's not like you have 3 chances at marriage, which is sometimes how people interpret the overuse of economy in the church. It's rather divorce is never viewed as good. There are certain cases where it's acceptable, but remarriage after divorce is not something generally blessed by the church. It's tolerated by the church, and you can get a blessing to do so, but marriage is meant to last for a lifetime. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. But what does St. Paul say? He recommends that people who are divorced not remarry. Something certainly not very popular in our culture. However, for people who are widowed, they can remarry if necessary. But even there, he recommends celibacy. Now, this can, and some authors have expanded this into the idea that marriage is an eternal thing, and then there are problems with that argument. But the church takes marriage very seriously, and it takes the relationship very seriously, because whenever there is a divorce, it has massive spiritual as well as psychological and emotional consequences on the people who are involved, and it's brutal, and it's very spiritually unhealthy, and the church doesn't want to encourage anything that's spiritually unhealthy. There are 4 legitimate reasons for divorce, according to the tradition. 1 is attempted murder, 2 is insanity, 3 is one of the partners runs off and takes monastic vows, and 4, of course, is adultery. But that can be forgiven as well. There's no necessity to divorce a partner if there's adultery.
No, you said that it's possible that one of the parties just runs away into monastic life. Now, is such a person supposed to be allowed in the monastery? As far as I know, monasteries normally don't accept people who run away from marriage.
That's right.
But
that's practice. I'm talking about the canon.
So how can it happen?
Well, I mean, people do all sorts of things.
So it's like someone comes to the monastery, doesn't tell the truth about his background.
Yeah. In other words, just abandons their family and and all sorts of things do happen like that. But it's a disaster.
So it doesn't have to be an escape to the monastery. It may be just that the person left his family or her family and pretty much broke all contact. Right.
And there are ways of doing that. For example, if a couple decide one of them wants to embrace monasticism, they can both decide to embrace monasticism. St. Gregory Palamas's parents, his father took the boys and his mother took the girls, and they went into separate monasteries. And since his father went to Mount Athos, well, that's kind of no visits. No visits. In today's world, you don't find that so much in America, but you certainly do encounter it in other Orthodox lands. But normally in monasteries, they want everybody to have their worldly affairs wrapped up. There doesn't necessarily need to be a divorce per se, but there needs to be full agreement and full acceptance by both parties. So, now part of this also brings us to another absolutely critical and essential aspect of our interrelationship with one another, and that's forgiveness. One of the most important things about Christianity, about living according to the gospel, is to live in forgiveness, and to live in a way where you forgive all of those who've offended you, and you bear no resentments. And at the root of that, of course, is to be able to freely love. A resentment against anyone is a blockage to love. It's a refusal to love. And when we forgive somebody, it means to open again the channel or the possibility of loving that person. That doesn't necessarily mean going back into relationship with them, but to love. And so obviously this would certainly have a big impact on issues of divorce and remarriage and all the family issues and everything else. But this is one of the most important spiritual aspects of this teaching. What creates more bitterness and anger and than all sorts of than love affairs? And why? And that's one aspect of the reason the Church doesn't bless sexual relationships outside of marriage. It creates too much hurt, and because it's not just about having fun together. It's something that hits us at the deepest level of our being, at least in this world, and certainly all of our emotions and everything else. And so it's spiritually unhealthy to enter into a relationship, especially a sexual relationship, where there are built up all sorts of expectations, which are almost inevitably going to be dashed. So the Church's teaching is there also to help us, to help protect us. To protect us from ourselves and to protect us from all getting wrapped up emotionally and sexually with other people in a context that is inevitably going to lead to hurt. And this brings us really to what is the real essence of sin. Sin is not about breaking the rules. Sin is about engaging in things, behaviors, thought patterns, words, judgments, all this kind of thing that hurt us and other people, and thereby break our relationship. And if our relationship with other people is broken, it's broken with God. And hurting, and that when we sin against ourselves, when we betray ourselves, when we when we hurt ourselves in one way or another, that's also sin, because it's self-destructive behavior. And when we engage in some kind of a rebellious activity or rebel against God, it's a self-destructive thing. And so, if you look at the whole essence of spirituality as this process of repentance, of being transformed in the renewal of your mind, in other words, by grace, and yet we cling to all of these behaviors, all of these thought patterns, all of these words, all of these, and not to mention resentments and emotional kinds of feelings and things which are self-destructive, destructive to others, destructive to our relationships. It's precisely all of that material that is what we turn away from, what we need to turn away from, and what we need to be renewed, what our mind needs to be renewed from. Because as long as we're holding all of that stuff within ourselves, we remain stuck in our own egos. And it prevents us from relating to God. Just as selfishness is a self-destructive attitude towards life, so it prevents us not only from relating to one another, it prevents us from relating to God. And so as we try to live a spiritual life, as we try to work out our salvation and draw closer and closer to God, all the ascetic disciplines of the Church, fall into place and make sense, because they're the means for us to put away the old man and put on the new. In other words, to get rid of rid of all of the old destructive and self-destructive behaviors and even aspects of our personality, and to be transformed by the grace of the Holy Spirit. And that transformation is not simply a renewal of our behavior, but it's an actual spiritual reality in which we enter into deeper and deeper cooperation with the will of God. Because all that is sin is that which is against the will of God. And we were created in order to do the will of God, in order to actualize it. In fact, to do it intuitively and not have to think about it. One of the most basic definitions in the Eastern tradition of the state of fallenness is that we have lost the intuitive sense of what the will of God is, and have to think about it. We have to deliberate between this and that. This is the writings of St. Maximus the Confessor. It's what he calls the distinction between the natural will and the gnomic will. The natural will is that which was the energy which is a direct reflection of the divine idea for each being, as opposed to the gnomic will, which is, instead of being part of our nature, is actually the creation of our ego, in which we have decided that we're going to decide what we want to do and what we don't want to do. And we can't tell the difference between right and wrong. We can't tell the difference between good and evil. Oh, we're doing no time. Okay. Does this make sense?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Questions? Yeah.
How does the church see if a baptized Orthodox person came to a priest to ask for a blessing with a non-baptized spouse or future spouse?
Well, it's normally, according to the canons, if you marry somebody who's not baptized, you excommunicate yourself. So the priest would not generally give a blessing to marry a non-baptized person. And he can't do the wedding because it's an Orthodox sacrament. And so, so the ideal, of course, is to marry somebody who is a baptized and practicing Orthodox Christian, and so that the two of you support each other in your spiritual life. There's always difficulties when you have interfaith marriages. You not only have to decide which church the kids are going to be brought up in, but do you go to both churches? Do you alternate? Do you just go to his church, or do you just go to her church? And usually marriages have enough problems already that you don't want to go in with a major disagreement already at the heart of the relationship.
Doesn't that sort of inspire a lot of phony baptisms?
Yeah, that's why it's important that. Well, phony baptisms.
But just people that are like, oh,
yeah.
I got to get baptized so I can marry this guy.
Yeah, like they said in the movie, Big Fat Greek Wedding. Guy comes up from the waters of baptism in the kiddie pool, and they say, now you're Greek. Would be like saying here, oh, now you're Russian, you know? No. And that happens too. It's, you know, the church really wants to encourage people to live really mindful and intentional spiritual lives. Now, very often what happens is that, especially when the woman comes in, first is non-Orthodox and then becomes Orthodox, usually she ends up being a better Orthodox than he does, or very often. He may have dragged her kicking and screaming into the church, but then she's dragging him screaming and kicking to church later on. But one thing that's, I think, important to or valuable to know is that according to the statistics, the kids will keep going to church if their father goes to church. They expect mom to go to church, but if their father goes to church, then they usually will follow. One of the biggest issues in Orthodoxy in America is that vast numbers of young people are leaving the church. I don't know what ROCOR's statistics are, but I think for the Orthodox community nationwide, it's like 50 to 70% leave.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah. And actually, in the Greek Archdiocese, it's the figures are the worst. Now they may go to other churches, but they certainly leave there. But you know, I think there's it's a theological issue as well. One of the biggest arguments, like from the evangelicals, is that, oh, you know, you baptize people as infants, but they don't have a chance to make a choice, and they should have a chance to make a choice and then commit themselves to church. That's kind of your classic Anabaptist argument. And then be baptized, except they say that baptism doesn't really mean anything, which is odd. Some of them.
Aren't there statistics for retention any better? Are the Catholic retention?
No. The statistics are quite interesting, though. It seems like most people who are going to choose a new church do so in their late teens and early 20s. If they're going to convert, that's when they convert. You know, obviously there are people who convert later in life, and some earlier, but that's when most people. And I think there's a lot to be said about allowing kids to make their own choice, because they're going to anyway. You can hand the faith to them on a silver platter, but they have to take it and make it their own. You can't, you know, people talk about being cradle Orthodox. Well, okay, it's nice if you're cradle Orthodox and active and engaged and intentionally living according to the Orthodox teaching. But if you're not, and you don't want to do that, why be a hypocrite? You know, that's one of the things that I think really it's a huge issue within the ethnic communities. And some of the churches that are the more ethnic focused, I think, you know, some of them just die out, because there's after a generation or so, there's nobody left, because the kids didn't understand the language, and they were excluded from the social aspect of the life of the church, and they're gone. It's a huge problem in America. The number one question among Orthodox in America is how do we keep our kids?
I feel like anything that you're forcing onto somebody, I don't value anything that's forced on me. I value Orthodoxy so much because it's valuable to me.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that I want. But not, if somebody had forced it on me, it wouldn't. As a child, I don't know if I would have had the same.
Yeah.
It'd be like eating vegetables, you know. It's like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I really think it's something that needs to be freely chosen. Not everybody who's practicing Orthodox has freely chosen to do so. Whether they're, whether they've been raised in it or whether they converted as adults. But I think there is sometimes there are other factors that creep in. One of the big targets that kind of presents itself sometimes are the Serbs, who build. I have this friend who's a Roquefort bishop now, but he built this his first church that he built in Las Vegas was a Serbian church, and following the normal pattern of the Serbian church, he built a huge hall with a huge bar and a tiny chapel. Next, he ended up working with the Greeks, and there's a huge church and a huge hall. Next, he ended up building a church for the OCA, and there's a huge church and a tiny hall and no bar. Now he's working on a Roquefort church, and I'm kind of waiting to see what that looks like. But the Serbs have put forth a really valiant effort in trying to maintain the kind of ethnic integrity of their churches, but they've lost vast numbers of people. The Greeks have put forth huge effort to maintain ethnic integrity, and they've lost vast numbers of people. And one of the things that's a real issue in the Greek Archdiocese is that the Greek boys don't want to go be priests, and their parents are horrified at the idea that their son might go become a priest and only make $120,000 a year, or 150. The Greek priests make nice money, and so they've got all these, all these converts who are going in, and some of them speak better Greek than the Greeks, which is interesting. But when that happens, that's a huge issue. This clergy in Roquefort, probably half the clergy are converts. About half the bishops are converts. In the OCA, in the Antiochians, 70% of the clergy are converts.
So basically, all the traditional groups are having trouble getting sons interested in serving the church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Some of it's financial.
I don't know. I mean, when I graduated from college, I certainly, there were some people that I knew, or later when I found out what they did, they had become clergy.
Mm-hmm.
I almost don't know a single young person today who is looking to go into clergy.
Hmm.
In any Christian group.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just where our society is.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a respected, cultures we came out of, say the Western Europe ones. Mm-hmm. You get some of that in the family. It was a respected, or you're a Russian that it was passed on there. I mean, it was a respected profession. It's not something people aspire to,
Yeah.
which is sad. I mean, they were tended to be educated and learning what they did, and it's a sign of the secularization of society.
Yeah, it is.
And it's absolutely not unique to us.
No.
Europe is in real trouble with
Oh,
it.
much worse.
Yeah, horrible.
They have the same, probably have the same problem with clergy too. Number of clergy. Although the Orthodox churches seem to be doing okay in Europe.
Especially in Russia, right?
Well, I'm talking about Western Europe.
Yeah.
You know, church in Germany is doing okay. The church in Holland is doing okay. There's probably, I don't know if there's any more secularized country than Holland.
That's right. That's right. I saw a big church being built when I was there 5 or 6 years ago. Amazing.
Yeah, monasticism
Street.
is present. So, yeah.
How much of it is inevitable, being that the world is going in the direction that it's going? I mean, how
That's a good question. You know, I think, it's certainly politically incorrect to be a Christian.
sure.
I don't know if people would, you know, on the other hand, some people are willing to fight against those trends, and even, you know, even to be a priest. I mean, people still tend to respect the priests to a great degree, even and Catholic priests.
Yeah.
You know, but I don't think people see it as very desirable. There's the whole, especially in the Catholic Church, the whole issue with priestly celibacy is big, and it hasn't been dealt with very well.
Is Orthodoxy in China?
The Orthodox Church is.
Recently, right?
Pardon me? Well, it's been being restored in China. For a long time, it was during the communist era. It's been underground, and Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeev was just there and ordained somebody, and they have several Chinese students at the Moscow Theological Academy. There's all sorts of laws and restrictions. But China is gradually opening up, and it's opening up to Orthodoxy, especially with this new kind of turn away from Russia, turning away from the West and turning towards the East. I think part of that's going to be a much greater influence on China. China will influence Russia, but Russia will also influence China, and one of the big ways is Orthodoxy. Historically, it's been present for a couple hundred years in China, and also it was in North Korea. There's some huge Korean populations in Russia, like 250,000. I think there's 250,000 Koreans in Moscow, something like that. Many of whom are Orthodox. So. So, what else? Other questions?
You're talking about the conscience, or not the conscience, where Maximus said. So were you saying basically that through the practice of, all physical practices that we do, over time we can develop more of that, what we were originally intended to have? And you were saying that's what we had before the fall, but we can actually attain it again.
Yeah, it's what we were created. We were created to live according to the natural will, according to how God created us. And then, as a result of the fall, that our intuitive perception of the will of God was clouded, and we had to choose between good and evil.
Children start off wrong, and we pertain or they start out like properly, and then.
Well, we're all born into a corrupted world,
Okay.
and you know, I think certainly little infants are sinless, but it's not long before they can, you know, develop a will of their own. And whether that's, you know, whether it's sinful or not at what stage, that's another issue. But you know, but the way we live in this fallen world is that we grow up making all of these choices, and what is the motivation for our choices? You know, the fathers talk a lot about the passions. And what, in a sense, the passions are a set of motivations for our choices. You know, what is it? Do we choose what turns us on, or what feels good? In other words, a kind of hedonistic motivation, or do we choose to do what we know is the right thing for other people, and you know, and for our relationships? Well, how often do we choose according to our hedonism, according to our self-gratification, according to the gratification of the ego, you know, our anger, our resentment, our, you know, all of that. So the point of the spiritual discipline is to help us become more and more conscious in the first place, and that's the practice. That's the higher level practices of prayer. That's the spiritual watchfulness. That's all of this, so that we can be conscious of our actions and conscious of our motivations. And when we see our motivations leading us down the wrong path, according to some kind of provocation from outside, then we can stop ourselves and say no. And that's where self-denial comes in, ascetic self-denial. Now, sometimes we will, and sometimes we won't. And if it becomes habitual, then most likely we won't, because that whole process gets short-circuited, and we're not consciously making a decision to follow our hedonistic desire. You know, I use I'm sure you've heard my using the love of a Big Mac. You know, as the...
But you don't like Big Macs, right?
Actually, I don't. I like a quarter pounder. No, but you know, very seriously, all the passions work the same way. You know, not just gluttony, but lust works the same way, anger works the same way, despondency works the same way, which is interesting. You know, but it just everything gets, when we habitually respond to certain kinds of stimuli or provocations, in the technical term, there always happen there, unless we're very conscious. What happens is that this whole kind of process of making a conscious decision gets short-circuited. Now, if we're acting according to our natural will, we hear an ad for a McDonald's hamburger, you know, and not to mention that it's Friday during Lent, you know, and you're 40 miles away from McDonald's at the monastery in California. You basically say no, and maybe the natural will would say, "Oh, disgusting," you know. Who wants all of that fat and processed carbs, right? But if we've got this kind of habit of giving into our temptation for that. Like you can't drive by a McDonald's without stopping in and getting a Big Mac or whatever it is. And you hear that ad, you know, at 10 o'clock at night in your cell, and with the radio under the pillow, you know, that you're not supposed to have, and certainly not supposed to be listening to when you're supposed to be reading your rule for communion. And you find yourself swiping the car keys and rocketing down the mountain at 80 miles an hour, despite the deer and the wild pigs, and pulling into McDonald's before it closes at 11. And even though it's owned by good Orthodox people, you know. But I mean, you can extrapolate onto any of the other passions, right? And that's fairly easy for us to do. Yeah.
So since you're talking about marriage and you're talking about this, how much should you worry about, you know, your spouse's weaknesses and sins, and involve yourself in it, or know about it, or worry about it, or talk about it?
Well, I think the better you come to know one another, the more you're going to know, and you're going to know what leads them into temptation, and you're going to know, you know, what to avoid. And so, rather than lead him into temptation, you can, if you say something, you can cut it off. Now, you also have to know what his reaction would be. Right? So it's just a matter of it's a matter of that dynamic in the relationship, and you can't ultimately you can't tell other people what to do. People are gonna, but you can agree to help each other if there's a particular weakness. And say, oh, well, you know, could you help, you know, if you see me, you know, getting, I don't know, if you see me obsessing about Hillary Clinton, you know, maybe you can say something and say, stop it. Or...
But if the person doesn't ask you to worry about something that you think is wrong, should you try and help them, or should you allow the Holy Spirit to do that?
You have to, you pray, but you have to talk it through. And it's, you know, most of, you know, relationship is about communication. And the deeper the relationship, the more profound the communication is going to be. And the less areas there will be that will be closed off. Now, there's always going to be certain areas where it's kind of better not to tread, and, you know, let the spouse be who he or she is, you know. But talk about it. And agree. So, you know, I don't know, you know, if your spouse is addicted to McDonald's hamburgers and he's...
Well, you can be a nag, you know, like I don't want to be a naggy, you know, nag. And if you know someone's weakness and things, it's like, well, you said you weren't going to eat that much, you know, like, I feel like it's wrong. It doesn't seem right to me. Like, for instance, we're joking about how we've slipped and said a wrong word. Mm-hmm. And then we'll like, but we both would, you know, tell the other one that we shouldn't do it. And so then we're like, well, we aren't in a place to correct the other one because we're sinners ourselves. So how much should we just be focusing on our own sin and not even worry about the other person's sins? Or how much should we be trying to help them? It's just sort of like that balancing act.
Agree together, because on one hand you don't want to be a nag.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if he wants you to say, You know, if I'm falling, catch me.
Yeah.
Just agree.
Yeah.
Just talk about it, agree, and act accordingly. Each one of there's another aspect of this which I think kind of clarifies, is that part of the spiritual discipline is developing our own conscience. Now, sometimes we need a little help with our conscience, but usually we don't find that very pleasant. And that's, I think, one of the things that, what you were bringing up could lead to. It could lead to a kind of unpleasantness and the spouse would feel like being nagged. But here again, it's all about agreeing together as to how far you can go with that. And the more that we develop our own conscience, the more we develop our own consciousness. Actually, in most European languages, conscience and consciousness are the same thing. It's the same word. And so it's a matter of being conscious of what are these kind of deep inner movements of our soul. And paying attention to them. Like, for example, the Philokalia the title is actually the book of the Neptic Fathers, the watchful fathers. In other words, it's all about being awake and conscious, and developing our conscience so that we listen to it instead of listening to our lusts and our passions. I'm going to stop a little early tonight. It's 9 o'clock. Pumpkin time, right? So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. We'll meet the next couple Mondays before we start the dogmatics. And I'll talk about confession next week. And I wanted to go through a lot of this stuff because it kind of sets the stage to talk about confession. Sin not in terms of breaking rules, sin not in terms of not observing the discipline, but sin in terms of a broken relationship with God. Okay. It is truly meet to bless the Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, without corruption that gave his breath to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify him. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever, into ages of ages.
Amen.
God bless you.